The excitement of the idea overshadows the fact that you're not just building a product, you're actually building a company. If you've gotten far enough these days to get investors, you almost certainly already have traction, which means you're probably not alone and you probably have a team. And so what ends up happening is that culture forms very quickly as you're adding people to the initial group. And so if that is not an intentional process at the outset that goes in parallel with your product development and discovery efforts, that we also need to develop an organizational structure around that, even a very early stage nascent structure that supports the kind of thinking and the kind of attitudes that we want as we're bringing people on board.
Hi, welcome to the Beyond 42 podcast, a series on navigating the uncharted territories of success and leadership beyond the product. We explore how entrepreneurs thrive, especially in the rapidly changing world of tech. I'm your host, Gökçe Gizar-Clover. I'm a serial entrepreneur and community builder in the tech ecosystem, and I invite founders, investors, and experts to dive into the concept of success and how entrepreneurs build resilience. Today, I have two amazing guests, Boris Grinkot and Sam McAfee. Together at Startup Patterns, they help leaders and their product development teams build great tech organizations that grow and thrive long-term. Boris and I go way back from my days in New York. We met at one of Adam Berg's gatherings, connecting people in the tech ecosystem. At the time, I was also teaching at Parsons at the New School. And Boris came to one of my graduate courses, and he ran a workshop for my students on value proposition, product, and customer development. He now assists organizations in navigating change and uncertainty. He leverages principles of design, continuous improvement, and social science. Boris has worked with organizations across North America and Europe, including Bloomberg, Moody's, Humana, and Unilever. He helps their executives design a trajectory for the needed changes for the organization. He also started teaching at Parsons School of Design and mentors startups and entrepreneurs. Boris introduced Sam and me a couple of months ago without much context. And within a few minutes of discussion, we immediately knew why he connected us. We were both passionate about helping founders and leaders build individual and organizational resilience. Sam is a Silicon Valley veteran of 23 years. He has helped many companies build and scale new digital products, find product market fit, and build and improve product development capabilities. He spent most of his early career in and around early stage founders. He started his journey in the Bay Area during the dot-com boom in the product and engineering side. He was a self-taught freelance web developer who then built his own business and ran it for a decade, leading a dozen engineers. He now works with product executives and teams to develop and ship new digital products from ideas to product market fit and beyond. Today, we have a discussion on leadership, organizational transformation, and being intentional about culture. We dive deep into the importance of communication, mindfulness in leadership, and similarities between parenting and leadership. We discuss the challenges founders face in transitioning to executive leadership and the significance of encouraging a growth mindset and fostering a learning environment. Welcome. Sam, let's start with you. From products to engineering, being a tech leader, now working with companies from massive ones to later stage tech companies. You help them build great products, results, and enjoyable places to work. How did you end up linking product development and organizational culture and strategy?
Well, the two go hand in hand in a number of ways. For me, what was really the pivotal moment was after working with a lot of teams, helping them with their product development methods and processes, like product discovery, being able to ship quality software. It became very clear that the teams could only do as well as the surrounding organizational tissue, if you will, leadership styles, org structure, the culture in the company. If those weren't aligned to support the kind of product development that I was teaching them, we would eventually hit a wall. So like the team could only go so far before running into challenges across the organization. And so a number of experiences really clued me into the fact that that kind of work is really related to organization transformation as a whole. The entire organization needs to be able to support the kinds of modern product development that we're trying to do. And if other departments that seem to be remote from product development functions aren't involved, there will still be an impact. So you have to get the leadership team and everyone else involved. So that's how it emerged for me organically in running into challenges with clients that I was working with.
What do you mean by the organizational transformation needed for that?
Usually, there are gaps in the team's ability to deliver that have been identified. Where with coaches and consultants and advisors, when we come in, it's usually because the organization has identified that it is in a current state and that there's an aspirational future state that they want to get to. And our work with teams, originally, we were focused on teams, but that was part of a wider conversation that was happening in the organization. There's always a business outcome that people are interested in. It's not just like, oh, our teams are struggling, will you help them? Well, it's related to we want to ship more of the right kinds of products to our customers. We want to ship faster than our competitors can. We want, those sorts of things are usually the business outcomes that people would come with. And so that was usually part of wider strategic initiatives to improve the way the organization is functioning. So that's what I was referring to in terms of transformation. They don't always say that there's a transformation going on. Like it's not always an official initiative, but it's always happening.
Thank you. And Boris, you also have a similar transition into organizational strategy. How did you transition to this world, and how did you and Sam find your way towards each other to start working on this together?
My career kind of straddles both engineering and communications. Spent a lot of time working with marketing organizations and marketing executives in transforming their organization from more traditional way of thinking to more evidence-driven and design of experiments and analytics and so on. So there was always work on the organization because I had plenty of experience with highly seasoned marketing executives saying that they did not quite trust the data because it's just not the way they're used to working. And those are the kind of moments where, as a consultant, I had to say, all right, we need to take a step back. This is not about just delivering results. It's really about changing the mindset of the organization and organizing around the ability to not just produce the evidence, but also plan and make decisions in a way that is centered on being able to get the data, get that evidence, and to be able to communicate that internally to all the stakeholders involved in such a way that they are expecting to have their assumptions and have their prior convictions challenged by the reality of data that they're getting. There's nothing in the scientific method itself that will allow you to make that sort of mental leap to work differently or to allow your organization to find out that your initial plans might need to be changed because by design, you don't know what your customers are thinking. And so you need to discover it, and then you need to change your plans accordingly. So long before Lean Startup popularized this kind of shift in thinking, there's other thinkers as well, like Rita McGrath and Ian McMillan with discovery-driven growth, that looked at the idea of the ability to change course as the core capability of the organization. So the requisite mindset is something that I had to tackle, and along the way for a long time. The shift for me was more from being primarily involved in actually getting the results in terms of, let's say, product management and getting to a product success of some sort, to really focusing on what is the mindset and collaboration need to look like so that the organization can actually achieve those results. And that has plenty of work in itself. Getting away from the specifics of an industry or not even necessarily a product focused organization, the work really surrounds the communication patterns that need to be developed inside the organization, the mindset, and the relationships between the leadership and their teams.
What you're talking about, the ability to change course and the mindset and collaboration and the leadership team to be able to do this. I know you work with later stage startups, so who have some of these skills and can come to you. And Sam, we joked before that if they have not done the work in the earlier days, that actually creates great opportunities for you to work with them to fix some of these issues that they have. So what are you seeing as the problems that they come to you with in later stages? And how do you help them through these?
I think that the mindset shift that Boris is talking about can happen anywhere from starting a new thing to trying to transform a large corporate behemoth. I think it really comes down to there's a sense in corporate or business culture that one needs to be right all the time and one needs to be very confident in one's visions and one's assumptions and one's answers in order to be successful. That's a legacy from 20th century industrial management principles and philosophies that largely ceased to be relevant with the birth of the internet and certainly around the 90s 2000s that style of leadership ceased to be effective, but it is very firmly entrenched in the management worldwide. Even when someone is starting something very early stage, if you have that kind of attitude that your sort of ideas are precious, your sense of self, your sense of identity is being judged by others about how right you are at any given moment, you're going to have a real challenge when your idea hits the real world. And that can really affect people emotionally, psychologically. And some people respond to that experience with an open mind, with a growth mindset, and say, okay, I'm here, we're trying to learn something and apply the curiosity of the scientific mindset, as Boris was saying. And others really struggle with it, right? It hits them sort of at an identity level. And so I think that a lot of our work involves opening individual leaders, individual people, but also the collaboration between people, opening them up to the possibility that being curious and thinking about work as a series of experiments is a safe thing to do, that you don't have to be right all the time and you can still be successful. And in fact, you're more likely to be successful if you have that open curiosity mindset than if you feel like you have to be buttoned up and sure and perfect all the time in a world that is full of uncertainty and imperfect information.
Yeah, I think just to add a little of the industrial era thinking, it's really about the division of labor. That's where this comes from. The idea that management does the managing, or the executives knows exactly where we're going and can essentially tell every worker what their job exactly is on any given day. I feel like it's just a convergence of these factors with different levels of toxicity that result in an organization where everyone thinks that managers know exactly what needs to be done. We know kind of some of the dead ends in that thinking, which is micromanaging, for example. We know that doesn't work. The reliance on someone to specify. If you look even at job descriptions, it's always funny to read them because they're always written with the assumption that we can describe exactly what the person needs to do. And so we have like this 40 bullet points telling you exactly what the job is. And of course, it includes, multitasking inevitably. When you see that word, it's okay. The person who wrote this has no idea what this company really does.
It's a nice pastime activity for Boris. What would be a better way of approaching this then?
So part of what happens when we go through this kind of transformation is letting leadership know that they don't have to have all the answers. That kind of frees them to do that. I think what Sam just described also is fairly unnatural, because even when we talk about learning, I think the concept in most people's minds about learning is that there is something to be learned, and then you learn it, and then you use it. And it's kind of the static thing that you acquire the knowledge, and then you put it to use, and that's it. So once you learn something, now it's the same thing. And so having designed or participated in designing probably could well be in the thousands of experiments, depending on what kind of measurement methodology you use. The big transformation that I've seen in how organizations handle all this uncertainty is just saying that, no, learning is continuous. There's no kind of endpoint to it. It's a continuous process. This is where sort of just acknowledging the fact, as Sam said, reality is uncertain. From the operational point of view, we have to be careful not to rattle the organization constantly with new information. Again, acknowledging sort of the reality of human behavior, we can't just constantly take in new information and change the course continuously. So we need to have some stretches of time during which we can say, this is what we think the picture of the universe is, and based on this picture of the universe, we're going to operate. But we agree that we're going to do that for a short amount of time. Gigi, to your question, how do we do it? We agree what is the time interval during which we say, all right, what we know now is good enough for us to move forward, to make some progress in this direction. And we agree that after that time interval is over, we're going to get back together and decide what new information did we discover, whether deliberately or incidentally, and then we decide how we're going to change our plans for the next increment. So that's kind of the core to building learning into organizational behavior that becomes the proper mindset. So once folks go through this process a couple of times, and a lot of the time when we engage with organizations, it's us doing it alongside with them for some amount of time so that that behavior becomes natural. And once the behavior becomes natural, then the mindset can start shifting.
I want to add just something briefly to that, if I may. I think another dimension I would layer on top of Boris's description is that there's also a structural dimension and a power dynamic at play in many organizations as well. That there's the mindset that Boris was just describing, and there's also the question of who gets to have that mindset. Is that just a mindset for the executive team? And then everyone down below them are still sort of doers of the instructions? And I think the answer, of course, is no. What we've come to discover over the last few decades of innovation in management methods and organizational structures and communication patterns is that the successful organizations are able to allow cross-functional teams of people in product development, but also in other functions, to act as the sensors out at the edges of the organization to their environment and be able to make certain kinds of decisions on their own based on, heuristics or decision rules, that everything doesn't have to be rolled back up the chain of command to check with the C-suite with every line of code or every marketing campaign or whatever it is. And so there's a shift also culturally in organizations to empower everyone in the organization to think and operate this way, not just at the leadership or strategic level. So I think that what Boris was describing is important in how every individual within a structure operates. And so for an executive team to embrace the idea of this continuous learning, that also implies that they have to shift the way they're working with their people, the way they structure their incentive structures, the org structure, the reporting structure. There's a lot of these organizational elements that also have to shift in order to enable this kind of thinking, because you can't just take this mindset and drop it into a typical corporation or even a startup and expect it to sort of work without really thinking carefully and shifting how people relate to each other around decision making and power within the org.
Before they become executives, startup founders are just founders. They're usually great product developers, and they know how to build a good enough initial product to get fundraising to then start building a team. What happens, because as you can imagine, especially first-time founders or very technical founders, they are not thinking about these organizational structures, the decision-making, how do I empower, how do I keep learning? I've also noticed that they start losing some of that curiosity, beginner's mindset of let's keep testing because we're not sure what's happening. What have you seen happens as they rapidly grow their teams, their companies, and it doesn't seem they're prepared for it? What are the things that they should, and when should they be thinking about this kind of approach to being very intentional about how they structure their organizations so that there's continuous learning and improvement in an evidence-based way so that they can keep building, innovating, and give this kind of authority and autonomy to their teams and create psychological safety?
I know Sam has more probably experience in growth stage startup environment. But my one thought I had from before actually is that we have probably different kinds of inertia in larger organizations where people are hired to be executives versus people who start the organization. But it sort of ends up resulting in a very similar anti-pattern. So startup founders, what you're describing, they go in with an idea. Obviously, they wouldn't start a company if they didn't think it was the most awesome idea ever, right? So they have that inertia of initial insight, and especially if that's been validated somewhat in the early stages, right? And they have got some follow-on funding that validates their thinking as well. So now you have a person who's been highly encouraged that their idea is right, whether by the marketplace or by investors. And so now to dislodge them, to get them into mindset, no, you need to continuously learn and revalidate your idea. That's a pretty difficult mental leap to make. In an enterprise scenario, it's more of a traditional view of inertia where people are just go into an organization that already has a way of doing things and has a particular, let's say, product they're developing. And the person going in is already assuming that is the right thing to do because that's what they're being brought in. So in both cases, there's this sort of the dominant idea of how things are done and why, and it's difficult to break through. So I'd suspect that for founders of startups or for early executives, it's equally difficult to make the transition, and they have to learn that it's important.
In the example that you mentioned, which also something that startups face as they grow, is how do they share knowledge, whether it's an executive who's brought on or that team is growing so much and they lose the focus from the initial team and company to just do other things. So then team members start leaving. How do they make sure that knowledge is shared to either new people or in the growing organization where not everyone is as connected as they were before?
I'm going to say something. I don't have the statistics with me, but it'd be interesting to see. This is my sort of anecdotal observation. Interesting to see if the data supports it. I don't think most founders who are first-time founders, that their first thing ends up being super successful. I think that there are some that do, and many that get fairly far along. This isn't to be discouraging. I'm just sort of looking at what I've seen. Most of the companies that have really made it, without a few giant outlier exceptions that tend to cloud our focus, are serial people have done a few companies. And so the reason I'm pointing that out is because I think that it's very easy for folks who have a great idea, like Boris said, they think wow, this is the best idea in the world, everyone's going to love this, I'm going to do a startup, which is great. I highly encourage giving it a shot. But it's extremely hard to validate and empathize. Like, doing a startup is one of the hardest things you can do. You can choose for your living. Creating a business from scratch, especially a technology product business. It's not very easy. And I think that part of what happens is the excitement of the idea overshadows the fact that you're not just building a product, you're actually building a company. And ideally, you're building a company that can, over time, produce a second, a third, and be a successful product producing machine that grows and makes money. And so when we're focused on the product only, what happens is that a founder makes some progress. If you've gotten far enough these days to get investors, you almost certainly already have traction, which means you're probably not alone. And you probably have a team, and there's already a folks maybe even working for you, or that enables you to hire your first few people. And so what happens with culture is that it forms very quickly. It doesn't take that many nodes in the graph. Single digit groups of people start to embrace, the founder has values that they're operating with, that they're either explicit about or implicit. But either way, those values infuse the other people they join forces with, the people they hire, how they speak to their investors, how they present to their customers. And so what ends up happening is that culture forms very quickly as you're adding people to the initial group. And so if that is not an intentional process at the outset that goes in parallel with your product development and discovery efforts, that like we have to do discovery on our product and we want to get traction and have this continuous learning approach to product development, we also need to develop an organizational structure around that, even a very early stage nascent structure that supports the kind of thinking and the kind of attitudes that we want as we're bringing people on board. And so I think the sooner that we can catch an organization in their life cycle, to have them start thinking intentionally about values and principles, and sort of, are you being explicit with the folks that come on board that we value continuous learning, that we value a fair amount of autonomy and independent decision making? Because to your question, Gigi, around like how do you share knowledge and how do you manage communication flows, it becomes a lot easier if there's alignment around the why that we're in this organization. What is it about? What are we trying to do here? Is the vision clear? And then there are lots of tools and frameworks that you can integrate into your company to manage knowledge storage and sharing and transfer. But none of that stuff matters if people aren't on the same page about what this company really stands for. The picture I would describe is, as you're making progress in the market, it's a great problem to have. one should be very much also aware about how you are building the foundation of your company as an organization as well, and have it keep pace with the growth that you're experiencing.
To that point, even though founders don't see this as a necessity, they see it more as a luxury at the earlier stages. When we started looking at founders who ended up building long-lasting companies with great organizational cultures, it was that intentionality from the beginning that made the difference between the companies that went bust, because more than 65% of the companies don't make it past Series A stage. And when you look at the difference, they say, oh, product market fit. It's none of that. It is, like you said, either founder conflict that also ties into not having a clear vision, not having a clear purpose, and not aligning the whole organization behind the same thing. So then they say it's a matter of limited resources. It's more that not using resources toward that same goal and just splitting your already limited resources across different directions that then drains you. And with that, I also want to say I can understand founders saying, look, I'm one of those leaders who thinks they should have all the right answers and look confident that I have all the right answers all the time. Because as a founder, I'm not only responsible to my team, but also to my investors, also to my family who let me go and be an entrepreneur in this risky thing. What am I going to do? How am I also going to think about the organization? Isn't it enough that I'm thinking about the market and the product and the fundraising? How does that work? What do we do? How do we help them?
That's a great question.
While Sam thinks about the official answer to that question, leaders do need to have certain answers, and they can't rely on an organization to give it to them either. So it's not, some things don't just sort of emerge or move bottom up. The leader should always be able to answer the question, why are we doing this, for example? They should really have the why. That's something that's fairly static for a long time. Of course, other things might be discovered in the process. But the reason why we got together, and this is something that probably startup founders and early executives have an edge over executives in large established organizations, is they have a much better sense of what that is, and they have a chance to articulate it, their vision, their mission, their intent. In plain language, literally, why are we doing this? There should be a very clear answer to this, because unlike large organizations where a lot of this sort of gets divvied out, you have HR who's recruiting people, and you have different departments doing different parts of the work. My kind of litmus test to any organization is people being able to answer why I'm doing the work I'm doing today. Gets very quickly at how much disconnection there is inside the organization in terms of being able to roll up the work that happens on a daily basis to the intent for the definition of success for the organization as a whole. So founders and early leaders of a startup have a much closer connection to what that is. Large organizations tend to be less capable of that. So the ones that are better at it have advantage in the marketplace, because not only are they communicating well internally and they can manage the work, they can also attract the right people to the organization, because those people join, again, not based on that 40 bullet point job description, but because they really understand the intent and they can imagine themselves being part of that effort. I guess a pitfall for founders is not to forget that that's important for people to hear and to continue to reiterate it, even if the organization is small, and not assume that everybody knows exactly what it is.
And what ends up happening is, as you know, I mentioned that we were doing an initial research on startup founders about burnout. So burnout has three components. One of them is exhaustion. That's physical and mental exhaustion. And it happens a lot in startup founders because they both have limited resources, whether it's funding or team to delegate stuff to, or it's because like their idea, they want to do it. So that's actual physical exhaustion. And they have mental exhaustion because they have to answer to all of these people, make the product work, make the team work, make the customers happy, make the investors happy. So the first component is exhaustion. The second one is cynicism and isolation. What ends up happening is they put in the effort, and you mentioned that they get that initial validation through some sort of funding or some sort of traction they get in the market. But over time, they keep putting in the effort, but then the results start being incremental, and they start losing the why, and they start questioning and become cynical about the work, the impact of the work, the significance of it. And then they start seeing even their relationships as transactional with their teams, with their investors, with their customers. So then actually, to your point, because they lose sight of the why, they struggle to communicate to their teams and the wider organization. And the third component is self-accomplishment, which is the one area in our research we realize that founders actually don't have a low enough sense of self-accomplishment to be burnt out, because they're, okay, I'm exhausted. I don't know why I'm doing this work, but I'm great and I know I can do great things. The moment they lose that too, they're completely burnt out. So that's one of the reasons I wanted to chat with you, because I know that you are also working to bring more mindfulness into leadership. What does that look like? How does that work? That is a bit counterintuitive. What are the benefits of approaching it that way?
So I think what's important to start with is that being a founder is inherently a very isolating career path, because of the people around you, unless you're talking to other founders, which of course there are many communities for that and people do, but the people that you work with every day on your team and your investors, like you and your co-founders, or if this is particularly true for the CEO, even if there are co-founders, whoever's kind of wearing that hat, no one else is having the same experience that you had. And I think along with the earlier in the conversation, we were talking about the 20th century management methods at scale. There's also a lot of mythology in Silicon Valley and innovation circles about the hero's journey of the founder, that the founder is this sort of solo lone wolf individual who has to be capable of these heroic things, rather than thinking about it as someone who is really the chief organizer of a group of people that need to do something together, and that's the difference, I think, in terms of leadership. Anyone who has an idea and starts trying to sell it to customers can be a founder. Founding something requires going and paying a few bucks and filing an LLC online. Like, it doesn't take much to start declaring yourself a founder. Being a leader is earned. It's earned and it's learned. It's something that it takes time and you have to focus on it. And I think that the isolation is probably, to me, the most devastating aspect. I mean, exhaustion's tough, but the isolation feeds into the exhaustion. Because we as humans, we need to feel supported. We need to feel connected, both with our own sense of purpose and with others. And so it's very easy for founders under pressure to lose sight of it. And I think the mythology in Silicon Valley makes it difficult for startup CEOs to ask for help, because almost, I mean, I don't know if it's the same or worse than C-level executives at large organizations, but talk about being expected to have all the answers. Like, someone just wrote you a check, for millions of dollars. There's an incredible amount of imposter syndrome pressure. What if everybody finds out that I really have no idea what I'm doing? There's a lot of fear.
You're right. It is really sad that right now founders think that that is the way. I would say that's one of the misconceptions about being a founder, because there's a lot of other founders going through similar things. And when we speak with investors, they're so eager to help them. Like, even though they put pressure on the founders, I think they prefer a founder who, when they're struggling, go to them for help. And that's the balance between, I need to have all the answers and I need to know exactly what we need to be doing, and I shouldn't signal any distress to anyone, and then balancing it with being humble and open and curious to know, okay, this doesn't seem like it's going to work out. We need to do something about it. I don't have the answers. Where can I find that from? Let me go ask for help. Because investors much prefer being in the know of the trouble that they're dealing with than to find out about it like months later, when they've already exhausted all their resources on this path that led them to.
When it's too late.
Yes.
I would then expand sort of the sphere of communication here. So if you look not just the organization, but also the investors, it's kind of part as a single group, right? investors have this essentially, they're not exactly above the executive, but at least at the same level. And if they haven't created a culture where it's safe for those startup founders to come to them and share their challenges, it's really on those investors. It's on them that it doesn't happen. So I would also then look at that larger organization encompassing its investors or its board members and so on, to where, well, what does that communication looks like? They're not on two different sides of some sort of a struggle, right? Their relationship should not be adversarial. So they have to be collaborating with each other in the sense that these investors have more leverage. They're in the position of power here. They are the ones who are responsible for establishing that relationship and that communication and that psychological safety.
It's great that some of the investors are being more vocal and explicit about it. A few weeks ago, I spoke with one partner at a VC, and she was saying if the founders are not spending at least 1/5 of their week with each other on their founder dynamics, what they're doing with the company, which direction they're going, then they're not going to last for long. And then she realized, oh, but as investors, it's on us to impose this on them, because otherwise they're not going to give themselves the permission to take that kind of time off the product or the customer or the fundraising to really do this kind of intentional work about their organization, where it's going, why it exists, and what everyone is doing and how they communicate.
That's really something that we see a lot, that there's not enough time of the co-founders or just their wider leadership team in getting together regularly, whether weekly ideally, but like really spending time continuing to integrate information that's come in, and like that why, the question of why we're doing this, there's an anchor there, but like our understanding of the world evolves. And so there's all sorts of implications with whatever's happened in the last week that need to be continuously tuned and refined, and our vision needs to be refined, and then we have to realign as a group of leaders. So I think a lot of what we will see is that with companies that have other apparent effects they want us to help them with, when we peel back all the layers and get to the root, a lot of it is that the leadership team is not prioritized that getting together and building alignment with each other, designing their business, designing their company, and doing it really regularly, doing the high level strategic thought leadership work, grappling with complicated ideas with each other, spending the time it takes to have those deeper conversations. If they're not doing that regularly, they're not going to be as successful. But there is this pressure that like, oh, we don't have time to get together as a group because everybody's all busy all the time trying to do the work. And so that also leads to senses of personal and emotional isolation, and then also strategic drift, misalignment and drift in the organization, which then, as you were alluding to earlier, depletes already scarce resources, because PF sales is pulling in this direction and the CTO is pulling in that direction, and they don't spend enough time getting together as a group and actually talking about how they're cooperating together to build a successful company. So we see that problem a lot. And I think another aspect that I wanted to just grab before I lose it is there's a delicate balance. I think, what Boris said earlier is really important, that the leaders of an organization, the founders, but any leaders that have been brought in, they do need to have some of those answers. They need to have like a core set. And so when we talk about being open and being vulnerable and asking for help, that's a balancing act as well, right? Like I would reference Brene Brown's work on vulnerability and Dare to Lead or other books by her. One thing that she really points out is leaders who are really successful should be apparently vulnerable, but not without boundaries, right? Like not completely mushy, because that's also not good. Like our teams need our leaders to appear like they have some idea what they're doing, but you can also balance that with having a sort of a questioning and growth mindset and an openness to hearing feedback in organization. It's not all one way or all the other way. And a lot of our work when we're coaching individual CEOs, executives, or working with leadership teams really is helping them strike that balance. What are the things that are certain? And leaders are often surprised that the part of the job is repeating yourself over and over again to the team. Even things you've told them 7 times before, you often have to remind people, like, this is what we're doing. This is our strategy that we've chosen for now. Here's how your work lines up with that strategy. They do have to project a certain executive presence, but then that can be balanced off with an open door policy, openness to feedback, being able to empathize with your teams and empathize with your fellow leaders. And that balance is one of the trickiest things, I think, for the modern leader to achieve. That's where, coaching, advising, support, talking to your mentors, talking to your investors, that's where that's really critical.
There's two very important things in everything that you're saying. That one, you should have coaches, mentors, advisors, community of support that you share this journey with. It will get isolating if you're not intentional about building that support system around you. And that isolation is going to be the end of your company, probably, which is going to be heartbreaking. And the other thing is, it does sound to founders and leaders like, oh my God, this is so much to balance. But at the same time, these are all skills that you can learn and develop and practice, and that will make you a great leader, a more grounded person who doesn't get the anxiety that founders get from feeling lost or what am I doing? Why I'm doing this? You're going to have a lot more clarity. You're going to give that clarity to your teams, because not everyone has to be working day and night and sacrifice everything at the cost of this, but working smarter and more efficiently. You mentioned that goals that are humane actually seem counterintuitive, but they produce better results. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. I mean, I think that a lot of success comes down to being able to wrap good people around a vision and enabling and empowering them to succeed, which often means helping to set or setting really clear goals, but then letting them do their jobs. Right. This whole conversation is full of trade-offs, right? There's all these balances we have to strike. And I think that, setting clear goals is part of a leader's job, whether you're a founder or some other kind of leader. But also, nothing will kill the morale of your team faster than micromanaging. And micromanaging usually comes from a leader who has lost control, lost their internal sense of control. They're sort of desperately trying to appear like they're on top of things. So this anti-pattern, the dysfunctional behavior, is to run around and try to instruct everyone in how they're doing their work. And it really backfires.
It seems like it comes from a little bit of fear and insecurity.
For sure. For sure. Yeah, absolutely. Kind of getting back to the idea of mindfulness, right? Like, we tossed that word around, but let's just take a second and define what we're talking about. Like, it doesn't have to be sitting in a cave on a mountain somewhere, like contemplating the universe. Mindfulness simply means being in the present moment, being aware both of my thoughts and feelings and experiences and those of the people around me in a really conscious way. So if you're going to do work, if you're going to do any kind of labor to, transform the world around you into something valuable, you always produce a better result if you are aware and you're in the present moment and focusing on what you're doing. If that work is knowledge work, all the more so, because then it involves working with other people. And working with other people is challenging, right? Like, we can all do certain tasks better by ourselves, but most of the work that we have to do in this society nowadays is collaborative, creative, working with other people. And so that requires a high degree of mindfulness if you are to be successful.
Yeah, it's a great point. A lot of the work is really being able to empathize, understand what's going on in the other person's head. What are their expectations? When we talk about leadership, communicating their vision and getting feedback, for example, it is important to repeat. But the other part of getting feedback is not necessarily to adjust your vision. That's what Sam, I think, was saying in terms of those trade-offs, or there are some boundaries, right? There's certain things you're not going to just change your vision for the company just because of employee feedback. But what the employee feedback can give you is, well, how is your ability to communicate your vision working? Are they actually hearing you? or what you're hearing back is completely different from what you expected it to be. It's a great way to kind of adjust your expectations, adjust your communications, right? To say, all right, well, maybe what I said wasn't landing, as opposed to saying, okay, now I guess they're not getting it. I'm going to go tell them exactly what to do. Or maybe you didn't do a great job of communicating your vision, or you're not communicating it frequently enough. It's not landing. Well, when in communication, when something is not working, it's on the onus is on the communicator, on the sending, not the receiving end of the communication. So if that means you have to adjust something. And I want to add more broadly, a lot of the stuff we talked about might seem kind of disconnected. So I'm glad Sam brought it back together, that when we talk about mindfulness and organizational behavior and the role of leadership, these are not separate things from making progress in your business. If you're not doing those things, what you get is an organization is disconnected horizontally and disconnected from the intent of the organization. And so they may be doing a great job, but they're just going in the wrong direction. So that's what I love Russell Aikoff's saying, that you can be doing the wrong thing right, and you can be great at it, but you're not just going to get the results that you were hoping for. So all these things are not sort of they're not nice to have. They're really material to being able to make progress over a medium term, especially as a founder. Obviously, you're doing something because you realize there's a market for it, or there's value to be created, and you can make very short-term progress without any of that stuff, especially if you have an organization of 1, 2, or 3 people. You have some knowns that you're already moving on. But as soon as the organization, even in those single digits, as Sam was saying, you're going to get communication challenges immediately, and you have to start addressing them right away. And the sooner you are to that party, the more you can bake into the organization the culture that you want to have, so that you're not kind of undoing it, which is a lot of what our work is. Nobody calls us in and says, oh, everything is great, we're communicating, everybody understands the vision, everything is fantastic. No, we get called in when all those things that have not been tended after are being materialized in serious failures, when you kind of can't look past them anymore, and you need to get outside help to really undo something that's already been baked in, as I said, into the organizational culture.
One thing I'd like to add from everything that you're saying, because at least once a week, I hear from 1 or 2 founders that I'm a great individual contributor, I'm a product developer, I didn't sign up for this. I feel like my whole job is just talking to people, and I'm not doing enough coding, or I'm not doing enough building. I feel like I'm not doing enough work. So it sounds like from what you're saying is, especially for startup founders, they have to realize at some point, if they want to be the ones scaling this company and building a team and leading that team, they should understand that they are signing up for this leadership role that requires mindfulness and communication and empathy, and developing these skills is something they can do, but it just requires for them to be honest with themselves and those around them to see if this is a path they want to go down in, or if they want to just say, you know what, I want to keep doing my own thing, build products. I'll let someone else do the leadership.
Founders are there to build an organization, not just a product. Even more recently, I've come across organizations that needed help. And when you have first-time founders where it's really their first kind of big full-time job, they don't really have the experience to recognize that they're there to build a company. And a lot of the time, of course, founders could be technical. Again, they discovered a need in the marketplace because of their expertise in whatever industry or market. And so their instinct is to build that thing that they think needs to be built, not the company, the culture, the communication patterns, and so on. And so that gets lost, and that's become something that eventually someone might catch up and say, hey, this is not working, but they may not see it at all. It's just a blind spot.
I love that. I love that. And what I would add is just, I think it is possible, if you want to be a founder, or you are a founder, and you're sort of like right in the middle of it now, and you're still really early stage, if at all possible, I would try to think about a decision as to whether you truly want to grow into being the CEO of a company, which is a different job than starting something with like being a product developer, right? Like someone out running around building a product, showing it to customers. There are people that can do both, but I think it is important to just sort of think about during those early stages, either if you want to end up being the CEO for the long run, then you need to also work on building those skills, which is not really about product development, right? And so if that's your choice, if you feel like that's really the way you want to go, then you need to build in early leadership development and organization strength as well. Or I think it's actually perfectly acceptable for people to found a company or a founding team to expect to hand off and recruit a great CEO at some point, maybe around Series A. I don't think there has to be exact playbook, but at some point you decide that that's not your passion. You don't want to move that far away from the product. Totally fine. But be prepared on your path of building the organization that somebody needs to be the CEO. And if it's not going to be you, it's okay, but just have that as part of your plan.
One last question, completely shifting gears, parenting and leadership. What are some things you take away from one to the other?
Well, since I brought this up before we started the recording, I'll tackle it first. I often use the anecdote. I mean, really, I think a lot of it's around growth mindset. Even in the mindset book by Carol Dweck, she has chapters for leaders and a chapter on parenting. And so I think there are parallels with if you're building a learning organization, like if that's part of your philosophy, and it should be, because that's what most successful companies are, is that you have to allow people to learn. And so the anecdote of, trying to help your child learn how to tie their shoes, and you're kind of standing there watching them, and you have to be somewhere, so you got to get in the car, and they're kind of struggling. If every time you see them not quite doing it right, you get frustrated and reach over and just tie their shoes for them, they will never learn to tie their shoes. And I think that analogy can be pasted across all management or any function ever. This is the same thing we were talking about with micromanagement. If you don't let people have a safe to fail environment where they can make some mistakes and they can get feedback and learn from it, they'll never learn, and they won't learn how to learn either. Like, learning is in a way a skill. And so if the people in your organization, we go to a lot of organizations where we see, it's not my term, this has been around for a while, but a lot of learned helplessness. They're like, oh, our managers are always telling us what to do anyway, so why would we bother developing our own skills around learning and collaboration? So to avoid that, you need to really be intentional about letting the kid tie their own shoes wrong a few times until they learn it. That's my parenting tip.
That's beautiful and so profound.
But Boris is a better parent than I, so I'd like to hear.
That's probably true. No, just kidding. If anybody's looking for tips on parenting in this kind of podcast, I forget where it came from. I don't think it was Carol Dweck, but someone pointed out that most of the time when, especially young children, when they ask questions, they actually know the answer. They want to hear it from you, but they actually know what the answer is. And if you keep doing kind of similar example, but if you just keep answering questions, then you develop this reliance on, and you establish yourself as the kind of all-knowing source of all answers. Yeah. So the tip was basically to just turn the question right back and say, what do you think? Just hold yourself back from giving the answer. And I think that works with adults just as well. Somebody's coming to you with a question, you can turn it right back to them. And also as an executive, you don't want to anchor their answer, because we can also ask the question after, but that's going to be too late because now you've given them your point of view. And now, even power dynamics aside, now that you gave them an anchor to kind of either agree or disagree with or deviate from. But by turning the question back to them, you're getting a fresh perspective and you're getting the ability to think first and rely on yourself. And of course, how we respond to that also will either empower or disempower that employee. So that's your opportunity to create psychological safety, to encourage the mindset you want to be encouraged in the organization. So you get all these different benefits just from turning the question back.
I think, like you said, that applies to a lot of situations and settings. Yeah. Thank you. So before we wrap up, I want to ask both of you, what are you currently geeking out on? It could be something you're reading, watching, listening to, a new framework that you're using. What are you geeking out on?
Myself, I am going through a whole lot of Strugatsky Brothers science fiction and kind of cultural, societal commentary that they have built in. It's some of the smartest, I think, kind of critique of society that's mostly middle, late 20th century, I guess, if I define them correctly. Soviet science fiction writers with a lot of depth to their thinking and very applicable to society now. And what I think about kind of on the side and geeking out on, even from not necessarily so much technology, but the conceptual perspective, is civil discourse and how we can sort of create some sort of a sane version of it that no longer exists. Maybe never existed, but certainly our technology today scaled up kind of the worst in human psychology and to take advantage of flaws in our psyche. And so how can we get away from that to a better way of thinking about society and our interactions in it?
Wow. And Sam?
I see your science fiction societal critique and raise you. I'm obsessed currently with grilling and barbecue. And so I've been spending a lot of time cooking and perfecting methods. And my Instagram feed is full of all sorts of chefs and people trying new techniques. As the summer is coming, I'm getting the grill ready and we'll be trying lots of new recipes. So that's actually what I'm currently geeking out on. That's what brings me joy. How I really spend my time, and I'm happy.
We can see that, yes. The joy in Sam's face, even talking about barbecue.
And I read science fiction too, but...
Thank you so much for joining today. It was lovely hanging out with you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning into this week's episode. Subscribe to our newsletter at beyond42.co and find out how we work with founders on their journey of success and leadership beyond the product. We deeply appreciate the support of our community on our journey. We love sharing these inspiring stories and practical insights. Please follow us and leave us a review, as it really helps us. Subscribe to the Beyond 42 podcast on your favorite streaming platform to catch upcoming episodes.